Dr. Richard Webby is a member of the Department of Host Microbe Interactions at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where he also directs the World Health Organization Collaborating Center for Studies on the Ecology of Influenza in Animals and Birds. He is a virologist who has spent over 25 years studying influenza at the human-animal interface, most recently in response to the incursion of H5N1 bird flu viruses into the Americas. Dr. Webby, please give your presentation at this time.
Thanks, Van Noel, and thanks to Kevin for organizing and everyone who's still hanging in there online. I suspect a good deal of you are probably halfway through your second cocktail, which not a bad place to be. So what I'm going to talk about, so as Michael just took you through a pandemic that actually happened, what I'm going to tell you about is one that actually hasn't occurred yet, a little bit about why we think that is and what's being done. There's also a couple of speakers at the end of this, far more intelligent than me, are going to deal with this virus from the animal perspective. I'm going to come at this, although this is really and still is a virus of animals at this stage, or other animals excluding humans. I'm going to come at this from a human health perspective, the perspective of a virus that's out there that we all have concerns is going to be the next reason that Michael has to bring out his elimination strategies. But to start with a little bit of flu 101, one of the reasons why bird flu is actually a terrible name, bird flu that we're talking about in media right now is a very specific virus. But when we look at sort of the family trees of all influenza viruses, whether they be seasonal human influenza, whether they be influenza viruses circulating in swine populations, you go up their family tree, all of those viruses start off as viruses of birds. So within particularly the migratory bird populations of the world, there's a huge diversity of influenza viruses of all sort of shapes and flavors of flu. We refer to these viruses based on the properties of two of the proteins that sit on the surface of the virus, the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, or H and N. And we refer to these viruses based on those properties. So we're going to talk a lot this time about the H5N1 virus. That simply means it's a virus that has a hemagglutinin of type 5 and a neuraminidase of type 9. And there's 16 different hemagglutinin subtypes circulating in these wild bird populations, 9 neuraminidase, and all different combinations in between. It seems like New Jersey's been a common thread today. This picture here is actually taken from the New Jersey side of the Delaware Bay in the US East Coast. Particular picture here is taken about May every year, where these migratory birds, here a lot of red knots and red turnstones, birds that are flying up from some as far away as South America. They stop on this beach every year to stop on their migratory pathway to gorge themselves on the horseshoe crab eggs, which at that same time of year are coming ashore to lay their eggs. They refuel and then carry on their northward migration. To give you sort of a flavor of how much influenza is actually in these populations, it's sort of a glamorous job, but a couple of weeks every year we send folks up to those beaches in New Jersey. They collect fecal material off the beaches and ship them back to the lab, fecal material from the birds. We ship them back to the lab and we look to see how many of those have flu. It varies every year, so sometimes we get a lot of virus, sometimes not as much. But typically on average, somewhere in that 15 odd % range of those samples are positive for an influenza virus. And you think of this type of picture with 15% of those animals having an active influenza infection, that's an incredible amount of virus that's actually in some of these environments. But luckily, at least from a context of public health, most of those viruses don't seem to be able to infect anything else. They stay within these wild bird populations. That's their homes, and they spread within those animals or birds. And it's only a small fraction of the viruses, influenza viruses circulating, that find their way into other hosts. This is a very, very incomplete sort of listing of the different hosts of influenza. We're going to introduce more of those as we go through. But again, a small percentage that finds their way into some of these other hosts and form stable lineages. From the perspective of human health, we don't think these viruses transmit very readily from the wild birds into humans. And when we do see human infections with some of these avian influenza viruses, it tends to be from what we call intermediate hosts. So they spill over from here into domestic poultry species or into swine. And then we see, again, sporadic zoonotic infections of humans where they're one-off infections from a chicken to a human, but no onward transmission within humans. And then roughly 3 times a year, that changes. The virus spills over to a human, and then they transmit it to another human, and so on and so on and so on. And then we have a pandemic. In terms of zoonotic infections, we see a number of these globally every year, and it's with different viruses. So this is just a summary taken from the last WHO vaccine selection meeting, which was in February of this year. There'll be another one coming up in September. But just looking at that time period from September 24 to February 25, in terms of some of the avian influenza viruses that were detected in humans, the H9N2 is a very, very common lineage of avian influenza that circulates in poultry in many, many regions of the world. 16 cases reported in the short time period in China, in the mainland. Most of infections with this particular form of the virus occurs in young individuals. That's not universally the case with all of these. Another more rarer human infection with an H10N3 version. This was a severe. A lot of the H9N2s tend to be mild. We also see spillover every year of these influenza viruses that again started their life off in wild birds, made their way into swine populations, transmitted between swine, and then sporadically spill over to infect humans. In the US, we see a lot of this occurring at the agricultural fairs. So it's fair season now, of course, in many parts of the US are coming to an end, where we bring a lot of these animals into close confinements in the swine barns. At the fair, we get a lot of kids and people coming through those barns, and we get spillover occurring. A lot of these other ones here, particularly the avian influenza infections, occurs in live poultry markets in China as well. Again, where we're bringing poultry into close contact with humans and increases a chance for spillover. In terms of what we really mean when we talk about bird flu or avian influenza right now, the H5 version of the virus, again, during the same period, we saw infections across many regions of the world. The big player in the last few years, I guess, unfortunately for us, has been the US. We'll come to this, and that's with the introduction of this virus from Eurasia over the past few years, and then transmission of that virus from birds into cattle. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. So again, just to reiterate, we have a lot of viruses circulating in some of these, particularly the wild bird populations, a lot of viruses in some of these others, but a much less diversity circulating. We see a somewhat predictable spillover of these viruses to humans, where we get a single infection, no transmission to another human, and then very rarely this transmission from human to human. And of course, that's what we're worried about, because that's what's separating from a zoonotic transmission to a pandemic. So what is stopping that? We're getting a lot of these avian influenza virus infections, but they're not clearly, most of these viruses are not well adapted to humans. And we know a little bit about why that is. So we heard Dr. Webby talk earlier about the interaction of measles virus with the receptor on the host cell. We know a lot about influenza virus as well. So we know that influenza viruses bind to sugars on the surface of the cells they're trying to infect. That's the first part of the infectious cycle. As it turns out, influenza A viruses that are really of avian origin or in avians bind to a slightly different form of that sugar on the surface of the cell than human adapted viruses with. And this is probably the biggest single block to, I guess, a more surge of human infections with these avian influenza viruses, simply because these viruses don't bind well to human cells. They don't bind, they can't get in, and therefore they can't replicate. There's also blocks within the cell. So again, influenza virus, depending on sort of which textbook you read, can produce anywhere up to 10, 12 proteins. Compare that to a human cell, which can produce somewhere in a range of 20 to 30,000 proteins. So these viruses get into the cell, but they don't have enough proteins to really make copies in the cell. So they've got to interact and steal the action of a lot of host proteins as well. And you can imagine the proteins they've got to interact with inside an avian cell are sometimes a little bit different than the proteins that virus has to interact with within a human cell. And so again, the virus, again, to become switch from being a duck virus to being a human virus, has to switch its receptor to be much more able to bind to human cells. And then when it gets in those cells, has to be much more able to interact with human cell proteins rather than avian cell proteins. And we know some of the molecular markers on a virus that mediate these two properties. And we'll come back to that later when we're looking for evidence that some of these avian influenza viruses are starting to adapt to humans. We have some idea of what we actually need to look for, and we can do that from genetic sequencing. Sort of coming back to the H5 virus now, this is a virus that sort of global public health has actually been doing a little bit of a chicken little on for a number of years. So sort of the royal we have been ringing the alarm bells for a long time about the threat of H5N1 in terms of being the next human pandemic. It really started back in 1997 in the live poultry markets of Hong Kong. This was the first time that humans were observed to be infected with this particular virus. The first time actually that we saw a completely avian virus infect humans. There were 18 infections back then. 6 of those were fatal. When they realized the virus was coming from the live poultry markets, the authorities in Hong Kong raced out, depopulated all the poultry in Hong Kong. That got rid of the virus. And because it was going bird to human and not human to human, they got rid of the birds, they got rid of the virus. And certainly the human cases dropped off. Unfortunately, while the virus was eradicated from Hong Kong, it wasn't in other parts of the world. And so it continued to circulate in birds. In 2004, there was another scare. The virus seemed to get out of Southeast China and certainly then move into other parts of Southeast Asia. Those cases in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand. So a little bit of an expansion of the geographic range of the virus. And then from mid 2005 onwards, the virus then spread out of Southeast Asia through migratory birds and moved westward through Europe and seeded parts of Africa up until 2021, which we'll come to again. The Americas were relatively free of this virus apart from one introduction that was short-lived. Sort of want to hammer home that although H5s have been around for a long time, a quarter of a century, we've been saying, look out, this virus is coming. The current batch of viruses, and some of you who were flu nomenclature aficionados will recognize the virus as the 2344Bs. Somewhere around, this is just a summary of the number of poultry outbreaks reported to animal health entities. You can see from about 2005 to 2019, it was relatively constant. But then we saw this explosion, and this was due to the something happened with the 2344B H5N1 viruses somewhere, probably North Africa or Europe. They became supercharged for replication and transmission in these wild bird populations. We don't understand what changed. We don't understand how it changed, but it did change. And we saw much more spread in those wild bird populations, much more spillover into domestic poultry. And again, from those of us from a very America-centric point of view, I think the biggest take home from was that then we also saw this virus spill over into the Americas. It came from Europe in late 2021 and was picked up first on the east coast of Canada, and from there spread south. And we, like the rest of the world that's been dealing with it for a long time before that, have been dealing with the virus ever since. We've also seen this virus do things that meaning the current version of H5, that we haven't seen H5 necessarily do before. We've seen many, many more mammals infected with these H5 viruses, presumably a lot of them scavenging mammals. We think probably because of this, they come across a dead wild bird, they take a big old bite, they get a huge dose of virus, and they get infected. Again, limited evidence for spread within these mammal species, but we worry when we see this. And we worry when we see that because, again, we talked about these bird viruses have to change, have to mutate to be more infectious for humans. While they're circulating in birds, there's not a lot of pressure on those viruses to make those changes, and there's probably pressure against them to do so. But when we get replication in a mammal species, that's when we start to get more concerned, because it's probably these types of hosts where we're going to see those changes occur and this virus become a little bit more mammal adapted. And we saw a lot of, this is just out of actually Metro Atlanta, a lot of die-off of scavenging birds as well. Again, probably because typically these birds probably don't see a lot of influenza because of this elevated activity, decimated to wild bird populations. We also saw a host of influenza we didn't even know could be hosts, and this included seals and porpoises. So again, for the first time, we realized these animals can actually be hosts of influenza, and they have been infected with this virus. This, however, I think was the biggest surprise. This is actually what happens when you ask ChatGPT to draw a surprised cow. I think if there was anyone more surprised than cows at the beginning of 2024 when this virus was found inside cows, it was influenza virologists. Because this host was not actually considered to be a susceptible host for avian influenza viruses. And clearly this virus has told us that that's not the case. And I'm sure our speakers at the end of the session are going to cover this in more detail. So I'm going to skim over a lot of the details, apart to say this transmission event occurred probably somewhere towards the end of 2023, early 2024. Again, we don't know how it happened, but the avian influenza H5N1 virus found its way probably from migratory birds, either directly or perhaps through some other intermediate host, into the dairy cattle population of the US. And of course, one, influenza doesn't infect cows, and the clinical manifestation in these animals early on was mastitis. So if you have a sick cow with mastitis, one thing you're not going to look for, of course, is influenza. And that's why it took a long period of time to actually identify the cause of this. It was only because of some really astute veterinarians that saw dead birds and cats on these farms that we realized what was causing it. Anyway, of course, that virus has spread through the dairy industry. Again, it seems to be transmitting not via sort of that typical respiratory route, but more through contaminated milk. Almost all of the virus in an infected cow is in the udder, not in the respiratory tract. And similarly, if we look to where we're now starting to see human cases, again, most of the human cases we're seeing are not respiratory cases. They're actually conjunctivitis, where farm workers on these farms, heavily contaminated environments, they're milking the cows, the milk is contaminated, it splashes into their eyes, and they're actually getting conjunctivitis. Not surprising from a flu perspective. We talked about those receptors that avian viruses like to bind. Actually, the eye is full of those receptors that these avian viruses like to bind. So again, why it's probably infecting the conjunctiva, but not actually infecting much of the respiratory tract at all. I forget the numbers we're actually up to now. It's into the 70 odd cases of human influenza in the US with this virus. A good deal of those are from individuals exposed to infected dairy cattle. Others are individuals that actually go on to infected poultry premises and depopulate, where there's a lot of dander, a lot of virus blown into the air. Again, it probably lands in the eye and causes that. Sort of back in the beginning of 2024, when this first came to light, that not only were we seeing infection of cows, we're actually seeing transmission of that virus from cow to cow. Again, this really got many of us worried that, okay, now we're going to start to see this virus, which for the past 25 years has been circulating in birds, hasn't picked up these mutations that make it more infectious for humans. Now it's in a mammal, we're in trouble. Luckily, that hasn't actually been the case. So from the perspective of the influenza virus, it looks like the udder of a cow is more like the inside of a bird than the respiratory tract of a human. So these viruses have maintained their avian virus phenotypes, despite the fact that they're now passaging in a mammalian host. So again, these markers in the virus that we look for that would suggest a changing preference, they're looking to bind more, perhaps the receptors that humans have or replicating in a human cell. We have not seen those markers to any great degree. We see sporadic emergence of them, but certainly nothing to suggest that they're being selected for in cattle. So I think this is how I see the current, particularly the bovine outbreak. We have dodged a big bullet here. Had this virus been perhaps in swine instead of dairy cattle, I think we'd be in a much different situation. But of course, we can't continue to dodge these bullets. This virus is going to keep firing at us. What can we do? From a perspective of stopping this pandemic happening, there's nothing we can actually do in human populations to stop a H5 pandemic from happening. If we want to stop it from happening, we have to do it. It comes down to control of this virus in these source populations. And as you can imagine, there are limited opportunities for doing this in wild animals, particularly the wild waterfowl that fly north south in huge numbers every year. Of course, these birds are actually about, well, some of them have started, but about to start moving en masse from their northern breeding grounds down to their wintering. So it's been interesting to see what happens when they come down this year. Limited we can do in those populations. Some suggestion that particularly when there are some large die-offs of these bird populations, to remove the carcasses quickly before these scavenging mammals, before these other scavenging birds get time to feed. There's a little bit more we can do in the domestic poultry species. And again, from the perspective of human infections, it's from these domestic species where most of these human infections are occurring, from the dairy cattle, from the poultry populations, particularly during depopulation. And certainly, again, I suspect some of our later speakers will touch on this, but certainly we can some pushes to improve biosecurity. There's culling is the primary means of control in poultry populations. Of course, this has not been employed in the dairy cattle. The dairy cattle has been more of a testing, so test for presence of the virus and put movement control on. Now, I'd suggest that hasn't been overly successful in terms of controlling the spread of the virus in US dairy cattle, but certainly that is now where most of it's at. Touch on this briefly, that vaccination is also a control strategy that's been used quite successfully in some other situations like this. So back in 2013, there was a different version of avian influenza that was causing problems in China. This was at H7N9. It was a seasonal outbreak that occurred certainly in poultry and then spilled over to humans. So each dot here is a human case. The red is the deaths. There were close to 1,000 infections with this virus from 2013 to 2017. After a pretty large fifth wave of this virus, the authorities in China started to vaccinate poultry against H7. Of course, it got rid of the virus from the poultry, will certainly vastly reduce the amount of virus in poultry, and we have not seen many. We've seen single-digit numbers of human infections since. So some evidence under certain circumstances that vaccination can actually both protect the animals but also protect human health. Why do we not do that? It comes down to trade. And again, perhaps we'll hear a little bit more about this. I'm going to gloss over it. But again, vaccinated poultry are very hard to trade and export, and unfortunately comes down to dollars really trumping public health in this case, and vaccination right now is not approved for use in the US. What about from the human health perspective for vaccination? So if this virus does come out, where would we be for vaccine? I think the good thing about H5, if there is such a thing, is out of all the emerging viruses that aren't in humans yet, we know more about vaccinating people against H5 than probably any other organism. And there have been at least 32,000 individuals that have been vaccinated with experimental H5 vaccines across all sort of different ages. And there are actually 20 H5 influenza vaccines that are licensed across Americas, Asia, Australia, and Europe. So, we do know how to make vaccines against H5. We know how to induce some good immunity. And despite them being licensed, they're not actually used or marketed. There's only one country, Finland, that's implemented a vaccination policy. This was really in individuals that were exposed to the virus within their fur, poultry, animal trade. I think they got bigger problems with furry poultry. Unfortunately, the uptake for that wasn't very good. But again, we know how to do it. How long would it take if this virus started to spread tomorrow to get vaccine? Probably at least 100 days before we get much vaccine. Those of us old enough to remember mRNA vaccines, though perhaps could have come a little bit quicker, and they probably will come a little bit quicker, and a lot of effort has gone into that as well. So I'm going to stop there. Right now, we're in a position where the H5 virus is still of low individual risk for infection, but it's only a couple of mutations away from changing. And we've got to keep our eye on the ball and try and do something to limit its spread in these animal populations. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Webby, for your presentation, which was an excellent presentation, by the way. One quick question, just from the US perspective. So has the biggest effect in the US been so far the economic effect in terms of culling all the chickens and the price of eggs that it resulted afterwards have spiked. That's, I mean, if you add it up, that's got to be billions of dollars. Is that the biggest effect so far in the US?
Yeah, I think, and again, Cinder and Carol might touch upon this as well. Yeah, but I think, yeah, it certainly is the biggest impact has been on the poultry industry. The dairy cattle, of course, have taken a hit as well. But again, from where I sit, and it's not exactly a place of much insight, but yeah, it's really the poultry population and industry that's taken the biggest hit.
Yeah, thank you very much.